The time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and good luck on your last day in the chair. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister claim he is opposed to mandatory vaccinations when he has imposed mandatory vaccinations on aged care workers, Australians returning home, quarantine workers and even journalists attending his own press conferences?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is wrong, Mr Speaker.
Members on
He's
my
completely wrong. Mr Speaker, the government doesn't oppose mandatory vaccinations, Mr Speaker, for health workers and aged care workers and disability workers. And, Mr Speaker, in particular, I can advise the Leader of the Opposition that it was as Prime Minister I took the proposal, Mr Speaker, supported by the HPPC, the medical expert panel and the Chief Medical Officer, that it was essential that we mandate vaccines for aged care workers. And, Mr Speaker, that was done in November. And it was not done until the end of August, Mr Speaker, mid to late August, that all states and territories had followed through on the commitment to put that in place. Now, Mr Speaker, mandatory vaccines for health workers, for aged care workers, for those who are working with vulnerable people was the clear medical advice, Mr Speaker, that was supported by the Chief Medical Officer, and that's what the government acted on and, Mr Speaker, sought to have those arrangements put in place through the states, which they have done. Over the course of these past few years, Mr Speaker, it has been essential to take a series of decisions to protect Australians. But the national plan that was agreed, that was pulled together by the government, supported on 2 occasions by all premiers and chief ministers, provides the pathway forward to ensure that governments can step back and Australians can step forward. Mr Speaker, there is a time and a place for controls and restrictions to be in place, and there is a time for governments to step back, Mr Speaker. And the government has always been clear in acting on the advice and listening carefully to the advice of the medical experts that have informed the positions that the government has taken. Mr Speaker, the government has not supported the campaigns of anti-vaxxers, Mr Speaker. We have not done that,
Members
Mr
on my
Speaker.
left.
We have supported the sensible, balanced approach, listening carefully to the medical advice, commissioning the Doherty Institute to provide the specific scientific hurdles for vaccination rates to be reached that would enable Australians to be given their lives back, Mr Speaker, and those restrictions to be lifted. So, Mr Speaker, I won't be verbaled by the Leader of the Opposition. I won't be verbaled by him, Mr Speaker. If he doesn't think Australians should have their lives back, Mr Speaker, he can make that case to them.
The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question's to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is working to secure our economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and provide more opportunities for Australian businesses and Australian families?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Wentworth for his question. Mr Speaker, whether in Wentworth or anywhere else in the country, Australians are looking forward. Australians are looking forward to Christmas. They're looking forward, Mr Speaker, to New Year's. They're looking forward to coming together all around this country. And, Mr Speaker, they are enabled to do that by the great achievements that they've been able to achieve over these last few years. Mr Speaker, Australians are looking forward to next year. They're looking forward, and they have the confidence to look forward because of what they have been able to achieve together, Mr Speaker, in particular under the policies that we've been able to put in place to support them through one of the biggest challenges this country has faced since the Second World War. Mr Speaker, as a result of that, we have one of the lowest fatality rates from COVID in the world. Mr Speaker, we have one of, if not one of the strongest economies, particularly advanced economies, coming through this pandemic in the world. And, Mr Speaker, we also have one of the highest vaccination rates, Mr Speaker, in the world. Now, Mr Speaker, Australians have been keeping their side of the deal, and I am determined to make sure governments, including my own, keep our part of the deal as well. The national plan is about securing Australia's economic recovery. We cannot take Australia's economic recovery for granted. The National Plan provides that way forward. It means that we can open safely so we can stay safely open. It means government stepping back so Australians can step forward, Mr Speaker. Australians have had to sacrifice much, and they have earned being able to regain the many liberties, Mr Speaker, that they had to forfeit over these past few years. And, Mr Speaker, the next step forward in that plan we've announced today with the Minister for Home Affairs, skilled migrants and students, Mr Speaker, will be coming back to Australia on the 1st of December. And they will be joined by all visitors, Mr Speaker, from Korea, the Republic of Korea and Japan, Mr Speaker, joining those visitors from Singapore. Further evidence that our government is keeping our side of the deal, Mr Speaker. Australians are keeping their side of the deal by getting vaccinated at record rates, 85% double-dose vaccinations around the country. But our economic recovery plan is also securing that recovery. Lower taxes, affordable and reliable energy, supporting our manufacturing and resources industries, Mr Speaker, ensuring that we're building the economic infrastructure that Australians need, particularly where I was last week, Mr Speaker, at Western Sydney International Airport at the Nancy Bird Walton Airport, Mr Speaker, a project that went nowhere under Labor but has been made a reality, Mr Speaker, by the Liberal National Government, where under 6 years of Labor they talked a lot and they did absolutely nothing. Mr Speaker, we're boosting apprentices, record number of apprentices now in trade training, Mr Speaker, 27%
has
up.
concluded. The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister claim to oppose mandates on hospitality venues in Queensland but supports the exact same restrictions in New South Wales?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, again, the member who puts the question is misrepresenting once again. Mr Speaker, let me be very, very clear. The government supports mandatory vaccines of health workers, aged care workers, Mr Speaker, and disability workers. That's what the government supports. For all other venues, Mr Speaker, and employers, well, you don't like the answer.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will either raise his point of order or not. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
The question went to, very clearly, hospitality venues in Queensland. The Prime Minister says it's a problem. You can't get a cup of coffee without showing your vaccine certificate. In Brisbane, it's the same in Sydney.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. Yet the Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, if venues, businesses, airlines, other places of work, Mr Speaker, seek to require of their employees to be vaccinated, they have that right under the law. They have that right under the law, Mr Speaker, but it is not the Commonwealth Government's policy that they should be told to do that. Wherever that is in the country, Mr Speaker, that is not the government's policy. So we couldn't be clearer, Mr Speaker. We couldn't be clearer. We support mandatory vaccines for health workers, for aged care workers, for disability workers, Mr Speaker, those who are working with vulnerable people. But when it comes to what happens in somebody's business, we believe business should make that decision and shouldn't be told by the government what they should be doing.
The member for Parkes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison-Joyce government is delivering critical infrastructure such as the Inland Rail, which will support regional communities and economies, including my electorate of Parkes? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I too join in hoping you enjoyed one of your last days in the tetchiest time of the year and one of the most difficult jobs in Australia. Look, I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question and note his lifetime work, political lifetime work, in supporting the Inland Rail and how important that is for our nation. Mr Speaker, the Inland Rail, of course, is a clear icon of how the Nationals and the Coalition are driving the growth of inland Australia with policies that will double the size of Parkes in the member for Riverina's seat, double the size of Narrabri, in the member for Parkes seat, and this is a clear indication of how it will reach forward to places such as Toowoomba, down to Albury, and also into Melbourne, to Brisbane and to Goondiwindi. This is a policy that clearly describes to the Australian people how this side of the House has a vision for the future, that drives areas ahead, that gives the infrastructure for growth. This side of the House can clearly state that the billions of dollars that were required for this project came from the Expenditure Review Committee and the deliberations of Cabinet, something that the Labor Party just left behind. They do not have a vision for regional Australia, and that vision on this side of the House continues on, Mr Speaker, with such projects as the Outback Way, making sure that we progress the process of sealing the third road across our great nation. That is an item that shows vision. But, Mr Speaker, the member for Parkes also asked about alternate policies, and it's very hard to divine a policy on for regional Australia from the other side, from the Labor side, from the Labor Green side, because they don't have one. Well, they might have one, but they just won't tell us about it. Because we've seen of late, Mr Speaker, that they've become rather sneaky, charmingly sneaky, but rather sneaky about not telling us about their legislation, such as the legislation they intend to bring forward in regards to their climate policy. And of course, I don't know, but I know that they're very charming, but they're very sneaky. And this is very important for our side of the House, because we are the ones that are coming forward with the policies, whether it's for dams. We actually built dams. We're actually building dams. The Labor Party in Rookwood Weir,
members on my
expansion
left.
of Chaffey Dam, Scottsdale Irrigation District. You don't even follow what we're doing, but we can take you to Scottsdale in Tasmania. We can take you to Rookwood Weir in Queensland. We can take you to Chaffey Dam, and we're built, and the process goes on. But, Mr Speaker, for us to keep delivering to this side, we must make sure that it's a coalition government that leads the way.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his comments last week where he said that people should be allowed to get a cup of coffee in Brisbane without showing their vaccination certificates, which are required by the Queensland health orders. Is the Prime Minister aware that exactly the same health orders apply in Sydney? If people want to get a cup of coffee, they have to show their vaccination certificate. Does he also support that?
The Prime Minister.
Speaker, I'll refer the member to my previous answer. I have set out the government's policy
Members on my left.
very clearly. It applies right across the country. How much clearer?
Members on my left, the member for Warringah.
Thank you. To the Prime Minister, in Australia, trust in government and politicians is at an all-time low. With a federal election now looming, voters will yet again be bombarded with fake news, misleading claims and outright lies. Will you prohibit misleading
member for Warringah resume her seat. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The member for Warringah will begin her question again.
Prime Minister, in Australia, trust in government and politicians is at an all-time low. With a federal election now looming, voters will yet again be bombarded with fake news, misleading claims and outright lies. Will you prohibit misleading and deceptive political advertising by supporting the electoral legislation amendment Stop the Lies bill before the next election?
The Prime Minister has
Speaker,
the
and I'll ask the Special Minister of State to add further my answer, but I note the member's preamble to the question about misleading, Mr Speaker, and deceptive information that comes forward in campaigns. And, Mr Speaker, I think she's just given us a preview of the Labor Party campaign at the next election, Mr Speaker, because they have form. They have formed, Mr Speaker. We remember the Mediscare misrepresentations and untruths, Mr Speaker. We remember the calls to pensioners in the night, Mr Speaker, seeking to frighten people in the middle of the election campaign. We remember all of that. We know they're doing it again, Mr Speaker, out there trying to frighten pensioners and do that on a daily basis, trying to operate underneath the radar. It's very sneaky, Mr Speaker, very sneaky from Labor. That's what we get used to. And we know, Mr Speaker, when the Leader of the Opposition can't make the points himself, he gets other premiers to make them for him, Mr Speaker. That's what he does. That's what he does.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Warringah has the call. The Prime Minister resume his seat.
Relevance, Mr Speaker.
The member for Warringah has the call.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. I didn't ask about alternate policies. I asked whether he would support prohibiting misleading and deceptive advertising.
That's right. The question had a preamble with a number of statements about fake news and misleading claims, and as I've said, preambles can be responded to. If you wanted a specific answer to whether the government would support a bill, it would have been better just to simply ask that and nothing else. So I'm listening to the Prime Minister, but I am going to say that he's been able to compare and contrast because of that. But the question was not about the Australian Labor Party. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm very happy for the Special Minister of State to add further that answer, but the preview that the member has offered in her question, Mr Speaker, of misrepresentations and deceit, that is, of course, a risk, and it comes from the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, would do it on every single election.
The Special Minister of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. The government does not support the AEC playing a role in relation to political advertisements. The AEC has committed to a Stop and Consider awareness campaign, which in the next election will be further implemented, as it has been implemented in the previous by-elections in Eden Monero and in Groom. Federal elections are a contest of ideas, Mr Speaker. In the 2016 Joint Standing Committee report into the 2016 election considered these provisions. They recommended that there be further amendments made to the authorisation provisions, and that has occurred, and this government has delivered upon them, so voters can clearly identify who is the source of the political information that they are receiving in electoral context. Mr Speaker, those opposite and the member for Warringah want to pursue a piece of legislation that will politically involve the Australian Electoral Commission in being an arbiter in relation to electoral advertising. That is an inappropriate role for the Australian Electoral Commission, and this government does not support that.
The member for Ryan.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. As well as substantial tax cuts for individuals and families, will the Treasurer please remind the House how the Morrison government's economic recovery plan builds on our proven track record of delivering tax cuts for Australian businesses, and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ryan for his question. Acknowledge his experience as a Brisbane City Councillor, Mr Speaker, indeed as the Treasurer of the Brisbane City Council, and in his electorate 60,000 taxpayers are getting a tax cut as a result of policies that we have supported on this side of the House. Now, Mr Speaker, in every electorate represented across this chamber, small businesses are the lifeblood of local communities. They are also the engine room of local economies. 3.6 million small businesses across Australia employ 8 million Australians. That's more than half the workforce being supported by small businesses, Mr Speaker. And we have supported small businesses throughout this crisis, whether it was JobKeeper, the cash flow boost, the most recent business support payments in those states that went into lockdown. And today we released new Treasury analysis and ATO data that showed, as a result of the tax cuts that we on this side of the House have supported, small businesses are getting $5 billion of tax relief this year and next. So if you're a small business with a $500,000 turnover, you're going to be $50,000 better off, around $50,000 better off. And what was also important to acknowledge in this new data is that small and medium-sized businesses have created 600,000 jobs between April last year and September this year. That's 1,300 jobs a day being created by small business. Now, you would think with that track record of creating jobs and supporting economic activity that those opposite would support small business. But we know that the only thing that they've got for small business is a sledgehammer, Mr Speaker, higher taxes for small businesses. And we know that the Labor Party and the member for Rankin recently took a plan to put a new tax on family small businesses to his shadow cabinet, Mr Speaker, to his shadow cabinet. And what would that do? It would put a tax on 300,000 small businesses. So if you've got a mum and dad cafe that earns $150,000 a year in that cafe, they will pay an extra $14,000 of tax as a result of Labor's higher taxes on small business. So, Mr Speaker, while we're supporting small businesses with JobKeeper, the cash flow boost and other COVID support payments, those opposite are waiting for small businesses with a higher tax.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How can the Treasurer make the sorts of claims he just did in that answer when the two highest taxing governments of the last 30 years have both been Liberal governments, including his?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Rankin, welcome him back to the parliament, the part-time shadow over shadow Treasurer, because that was a Dorothy Dixon, Mr Speaker, because at the last election we were proposing lower taxes for Australians and Labor was proposing $387 billion of higher taxes. And do you know who said they were proud and pleased of the housing tax and the retirees tax? Who? Sneaky Jim. The member for Rankin. The member for Rankin. The co-architect with the member for McMahon. And you know what the member for McMahon told the Australian people about Labor's high taxing agenda? If you don't like it, don't vote for it, Mr Speaker. If you don't like it, don't vote for it. So the member for Rankin has the hide to come to the dispatch box knowing that he took to the Australian people a superannuation tax. He took to the Australian people a higher tax on housing. He took to the Australian people a retirees tax. He took to the Australian people higher taxes on your income, and he took to the Australian people higher taxes on small business. Mr Speaker, a leopard doesn't change their spots. They know what the member for Rankin is all about, higher taxes on all Australians.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is also to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House of how the Morrison government's strong record of cutting taxes for Australian families and workers so that they can keep more of what they earn? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Robertson for a question. Acknowledge that she's a strong advocate for lower taxes for the people across her electorate, with more than 50,000 taxpayers in her electorate getting a tax cut as a result of policies supported and implemented by the Morrison government. Now, Mr Speaker, when we got elected, we said to the Australian people we would grow the economy. We said to the Australian people we would cut their taxes, Mr Speaker, and we said to the Australian people we would create more jobs. Now, after the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression, the Australian economy today is $300 billion bigger than when we came to government. $300 billion bigger than when we came to government. And we have legislated through the parliament $300 billion of tax cuts for households, Mr Speaker. $300 billion for tax cuts for households. We've introduced the biggest business investment incentives Australia has ever seen, and we've reduced small business company tax rates down to the lowest level in 50 years. That's our record. And when it comes to jobs, there are 1.4 million additional Australians in work today than when we came to government. That is our record. And our economic plan helped put Australia in a strong position going into this crisis. Our economic plan helped get Australia through this crisis, and our economic plan will help ensure our economy is stronger on the other side of this crisis. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we know what the Labor Party's plan is because they showed us at the last election. Now, on the weekend, the member for Rankin went on the program Insiders, and David Spears asked the member for Rankin a very simple question. The question was, would you increase taxes for ordinary Australians at all? Simple yes-no question. Would you increase taxes for ordinary Australians at all? What did the member for Rankin say? It makes sense to maintain some flexibility, Mr Speaker. To maintain some flexibility. Some flexibility to increase your taxes on income earners.
Member for Rankin.
Some flexibility to increase some taxes on your superannuation. Some flexibility to increase taxes on retirees, Mr Speaker. Some flexibility to increase taxes on housing, Mr Speaker, and of course some flexibility to increase taxes on family businesses. You see, a leopard doesn't change their spots, Mr Speaker. The member for Rankin, the Leader of the Opposition, they're only interested in one thing.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The member for McNamara has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister, when posting a video of his media conference to Facebook, delete any criticism of the Melbourne protests and only include the sections where he criticised vaccine mandates? Why did the Prime Minister claim he had denounced the violent protests when in fact he was determined to give comfort to extremists?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I completely reject that assertion, Mr Speaker. I completely reject that assertion, Mr
Members
Speaker.
on my left.
At the first opportunity when I appeared before the press, I denounced those things, Mr Speaker, very clearly. Very clearly, Mr
Members
Speaker,
on my left.
denounced that violence. I said it had no place in Australia, and it does have no place in Australia, Mr Speaker, and that is something there should be bipartisan support for. The opposition said the same thing, Mr Speaker, but they choose to try and play some political games with violent protests.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on my left. Members on my left. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Prime Minister needs to explain why he deleted the sections that were critical of the
Manager of
protests.
Opposition Business will resume his seat. We don't have supplementary questions. The Prime Minister is in order. The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I've been very clear in denouncing those things. Very clear in denouncing those things. And the suggestion I haven't, Mr Speaker, is a complete falsehood. And I know the Leader of the Opposition was desperately trying to make this point this morning. Rather than us being on a unity ticket that we denounce violence, Mr Speaker, he seeks to play politics with violent protests in Victoria, Mr Speaker, and I find that absolutely appalling. Now, Mr Speaker, we have the very strong view that violence of that nature, the intimidatory threats that were made as part of any protest, on whatever topic it might be, Mr Speaker, is deplorable and should not be done in this country. I could not be more clear than that, Mr Speaker. My government, Mr Speaker, stands for the national plan that we took forward, and we need to ensure that all Australians, Mr Speaker, can look forward with confidence, and that's what we're focusing on, the positives of the future, Mr Speaker, about where we're heading as a country, so we can ensure that as a result of the outstanding work done by Australians right across the country, but particularly in Victoria, who have had to put up with more on their daily lives, Mr Speaker, than any other people in this country during the course of this pandemic. They have had to put up with more lockdowns, Mr Speaker, more deaths and more impact than any other part of this country, Mr Speaker, the longest lockdown of any city in the world. Victorians have put up with a lot, Mr Speaker, and they have pushed through, and I commend them for the outstanding work that they have done. And, Mr Speaker, what is important is that we now harness that and ensure, Mr Speaker, that they can look forward to the Boxing Day test, Mr Speaker, and coming together around the Christmas table, because that is what has been made possible by them going forward and ensuring that they've got vaccines at record levels. That's what our national plan provides for, Mr Speaker. The pathetic attempts by the Labor Party to try and drive a wedge between Australians and suggest that there is no bipartisan support for denouncing violence in this country. I tell you what, Mr Speaker, it's been our government that has funded the Australian Federal Police to crack down on violent extremism, Mr Speaker. It's our government, Mr Speaker, that have actually supported the Federal Police. When the Labor Party was in power, they cut their funding, Mr Speaker. They didn't give them the powers they needed, Mr Speaker. And even now, over the course of this parliament, the Labor Party has had to be dragged kicking and screaming to this legislature.
The member for North Sydney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's national plan to reopen Australia is helping restore the freedom of Australians to travel, and how safely reopening our international borders to visa holders will create more economic growth and drive the creation of new Australian jobs?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker, and can I thank you for your service to the parliament, particularly in your role as Speaker. You have been outstanding. Can I thank the member for his question and for his very consistent advocacy on behalf of those in his electorate to make sure that Australia's borders are opened as soon as it is safe to do so. Now, Australians have certainly kept their side of the deal by getting vaccinated. So currently the vaccination status that we have in Australia is that more than 85% of Australians over 16 have received 2 doses of their vaccination, and over 90% have received their first dose. So that ranks amongst the highest in the world. And so now, in line with the national plan, we're keeping our side of the deal by opening our borders in a safe and very carefully managed way as soon as we possibly can. And we've already made some very important steps forward together. From the start of this month, fully vaccinated Australians have had the freedom to travel internationally once again, and fully vaccinated parents of Australian citizens and permanent residents are free to come here, so families can be reunited on our shores and grandparents can see their grandkids again. That's happening now. But it's important that we take the next step forward. So from the 1st of December, we'll be lifting the exemption requirement for a range of economic visa holders who are fully vaccinated, so that our businesses can bring in the workers that they need to keep growing and creating even more jobs. And that is so important for our economic recovery as we come through COVID. We'll also be welcoming back fully vaccinated international students to support our universities and schools and those who work and study here in Australia. Importantly, those fully vaccinated eligible visa holders who are in Australia, who have worked with us throughout the pandemic and who contribute to our communities, will now be able to reunite with their families overseas and return to their jobs and studies here in Australia. And will welcome a range of family and humanitarian visa holders. So on top of that, from the 1st of December, we'll also be extending the quarantine-free travel safe zone for citizens in Japan and South Korea, much like the system that's already underway for Singapore. Now, this is safe, it's important and it's fair that we go through this process of reopening our borders, and it is step by step that we need to take this. It's so important that we open up our borders as it's safe to do so. We committed to this. This is exactly what the Morrison government is doing. We are taking this one very important step at a time.
Well, the Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister claimed that Australia was at the front of the queue for COVID vaccines. Given more than half of the Australian population endured months-long lockdowns this year because the Prime Minister did not order enough vaccines when it counted, why did the Prime Minister say we were at the front of the queue when it wasn't true?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, Australia has one of the highest double-dose vaccination rates in the world.
Members on my left.
And in fact, Mr Speaker, when we set out back in late February, early March, we said, Mr Speaker, that all those who would want to have a vaccine would be able to have them in October, Mr Speaker, and that's exactly what happened. Mr Speaker, that's exactly what happened. In fact, Mr Speaker, despite the challenges we had early on, we turned that around and ensured that that timetable was actually met, Mr Speaker, and that the vaccination rates that we have now achieved, that Australians have achieved, Mr Speaker, are amongst some of the highest in the world, higher than the United Kingdom, Mr Speaker, even now higher on a first-dose basis, higher than the Netherlands. Mr Speaker, it's higher than Germany. Mr Speaker, it's higher than Israel. All of those, Mr Speaker, that had some early success. But now, Mr Speaker, we go into next year, and we go into next year, Mr Speaker, with those high vaccination rates, which enables to back in the incredible achievement that Australia has had to have one of the lowest fatality rates of COVID of anywhere in the world, and on top of that, Mr Speaker, one of the strongest advanced economies in the world. Only the Labor Party would want to talk that down. Only the Labor Party would want to talk down the achievements of the Australian people of having one of the lowest fatality rates, best economies and the highest vaccination rates in the world. What that speaks to, Mr Speaker, is an opposition that has been so intent, Mr Speaker, on playing politics with the pandemic, Mr Speaker, that they cannot see the achievements of the Australian people and they cannot understand how much they're looking forward to the hope that is ahead of us, Mr Speaker. Our government has a plan for that. We do, Mr Speaker. It was also set out in last year's budget and the budget before that, securing that economic recovery, investing, Mr Speaker, in the apprentices, trades and skills that ensure they're equipped, investing in our digital economy.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thank you, Speaker. On direct relevance, the question was clearly about the vaccine rollout strategy.
The Minister for Health is going to be the next speaker. The Prime Minister has the call. I'm listening.
Thank you,
closely.
Mr Speaker.
It was a specific question, though.
Yeah, and the reality that the vaccine rollout, Mr Speaker, has achieved those record rates of countries all around the world means we can look forward with confidence, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party, they want to dwell, Mr Speaker, and look in the rear vision mirror. What we want to do, Mr Speaker, like most Australians who are looking forward to Christmas, looking forward to next year, looking forward to opening their business, looking forward to welcoming tourists back, welcoming students back, getting skilled workers back into the country so they can drive their businesses forward. Mr Speaker, our investments in the digital economy alone
I just say to the Prime Minister is straying from a very specific question about the vaccines.
Well, Mr Speaker, what I'm saying is our vaccination rate is enabling our economic recovery, and no better confirmation of that than $1 billion of Google investing in our digital economy strategy. We're securing the economic recovery. It's off the back of record rates of vaccination, one of the strongest economies through the pandemic and one of the lowest rates of fatality to COVID in the world.
The member for Sturt has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government has kept Australians safe through the COVID pandemic, especially when compared to the rest of the world? And will the minister also advise the House on how the government will continue to keep Australians safe?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Sturt, who has been one of the great advocates for his state opening up tomorrow, of Australians returning to South Australia, engaging with the rest of the country. It's a signature moment, and it comes at the time that we see around the world another wave of COVID, a continuing pandemic, in particular ravaging Europe. And for those in Europe, we think of and pray for them. At this moment, 257 million cases have been diagnosed since the pandemic began around the world. Over 5.15 million, 5,150,000 people have lost their lives to COVID officially, with the real number inevitably vastly higher. Indeed, there are now over 500,000 cases a day over the last week. There are now almost 7,000 lives lost a day around the world. And against that background, as the Prime Minister has just said, our great and abiding national achievement is to have one of the lowest death rates in the world, to have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, and to have had one of the strongest economic recoveries in the world. If we had imagined and envisaged over 5 million lives lost 20 months ago, and inevitably vastly higher beyond the official figures, and then compared it with where Australia is now, we would have taken that. Albeit it's been hard and difficult and challenged, and lives have been lost, and so many people have struggled. But Australia has been magnificent. And what that means is we now have a vaccination rate of 91.5% first dose, of 85.1% second dose, of over 99% of our over 70s who've come forward to be vaccinated and protected in numbers beyond imagination. And we will continue to do this. We will continue with that vaccination program now with one of the world's earliest whole-of-nation booster programs. Already 333,000 boosters, well ahead of expectation and schedule at this time. But now we move forward as well with our treatments, with sotrovimab and Ronapreve, the monoclonal antibodies that can save lives and have been saving lives, with molnupiravir and the Pfizer protease inhibitor as they come forward, 300,000 and 500,000 units. And as they are approved, they will be made available. All of these things come together to save lives, protect lives and give us a chance to regain our lives.
The member for Richmond.
Question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister claimed he didn't ridicule electric vehicle technology. Given the Prime Minister said electric vehicles would end the weekend, would not tow a trailer and would stop Australians from going camping, why did he claim he did not ridicule the technology when he made these statements on TV?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I've made patently clear on numerous occasions now, whether here in this place or other place, what I opposed at the last election was the Labor Party's policy. That's why I opposed, Mr Speaker. We had our own policy on electric vehicles, and most recently I've announced what our policy is, Mr Speaker, as part of our broader lower emissions technology and future fuels program, Mr Speaker, to ensure we meet the commitments that we've set out most recently at COP26. We know what our targets are. We know what our plans to achieve those targets are, Mr Speaker. I mean, when we were last in this place a few weeks ago, the Leader of the Opposition thought the election was going to be on the 11th of December. In fact, he told everybody on his backbench that that's when it was going to be, Mr Speaker. But yet he still can't even tell them what their 2030 target is, Mr Speaker. He still can't tell them what all the sneaky taxes are that they're going to put on the Australian people, Mr Speaker. He thought the election was about to happen and he still couldn't tell anybody what was going to be going on. You know, Mr Speaker, there's one thing that's pretty bad, and that's when Labor tells you what they are going to do. What's even worse is when they don't tell you.
The Prime Minister has concluded his answer. The member for Higgins. The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is working with international partners to keep Australians safe and secure amidst a challenging international environment?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question, and thank you very much for her support of defence personnel and her electorate, and for the work that she does and her committee work here as well. It brings a wealth of experience to this parliament, Mr Speaker, and everybody on our side of the House is absolutely committed to making sure that we properly invest into the Australian Defence Force. Mr Speaker, when Labor was in government, they took money away from defence. We've put money back into defence. We've done that, Mr Speaker, because we are not weak on defence, and we are providing the support to the men and women of the Australian Defence Force to keep us safe, Mr Speaker. A very important contrast between that side of the House and this side of the House. And, Mr Speaker, one of the very significant ways that we will keep our country safe and keep our population safe into the decades to come is the AUKUS agreement that we've entered into with the United States and the United Kingdom. Our two most important partners, Mr Speaker. Our collaboration spans decades. We've fought alongside each other. We've invested in each other. And, Mr Speaker, in the agreement that we signed today between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, it will allow for a formal transfer, Mr Speaker, of the information that is required for us to commence our nuclear program of nuclear propulsion for our submarines, Mr. Speaker. It is an incredibly important program, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, we have put ourselves in a position of trust with the US and with the UK. There was a bilateral agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom entered into in the 1950s where the US shared their technology and information with the UK, and for the first time ever a third partner has been able to join that collaboration, and that is of course our country. And there has been a lot of work, Mr. Speaker, already that has been undertaken that has allowed a conversation to take place about how we can train up our submariners and our engineers in the program, and we'll have more to say in that regard. But, Mr. Speaker, the Nuclear-Powered Submarine Task Force has carried out a lot of work under the guidance of Admiral Jonathan Meade. I really commend him and his team for working in our country's name. And in an uncertain time in the Indo-Pacific, Mr. Speaker, Australians want certainty from their government. And we are providing certainty to Australians when it comes to national security and our response to the threats in our region today and into the future. And people understand, they've seen Labor operating in the past, they understand that Labor is weak on national security, Mr. Speaker. They've demonstrated it day in, day out, year in, year out, Mr. Speaker. And the reality is that it doesn't get any weaker than this Leader of the Opposition.
Members on my left, the member for McMahon has the call.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister claims he changed his mind on electric vehicles because of, and I quote, massive changes to technology since 2019. The CEO of the Electric Vehicle Council says he has no idea what the Prime Minister is talking about. Why did the Prime Minister make this claim when it simply isn't true?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members on my left.
If the opposition spokesman doesn't think there has been advances in technology since 2019, Mr. Speaker, then he's clearly not keeping up to pace, Mr. Speaker. What I do know, Mr. Speaker, is our government is not going to put upward pressure on petrol prices by changing emission standards on fuels, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to do that. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's important that the Labor Party come clean on that. Otherwise, that's just another sneaky tax on petrol.
The members on my left, member for Sydney, I'm trying to give the Manager of Opposition Business the call. Leader of the Opposition, Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. On direct relevance, the only issue relevant in this question are the massive changes to technology since 2019 that the Prime Minister has claimed exist, and he has to be relevant to that.
Yes, it was a very tight question, so the Prime Minister can't talk about alternative policies. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, in particular where I was on that day at Toyota, the advance in technologies that has occurred with hydrogen-powered vehicles, Mr. Speaker, particularly consumer vehicles, and in heavy industry, Mr. Speaker, in heavy vehicles, this has come forward in leaps and bounds, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Leader of the Opposition says hydrogen vehicles is not EV, Mr. Speaker. I just heard him say it. What does he think hydrogen does in an electric vehicle, Mr. Speaker? It converts it into electricity which drives the battery, Mr. Speaker. That's what an electric vehicle is. It can be powered by a charger, it can be powered by hydrogen, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has no clue what he's talking about when it comes to these vehicles. Now, Mr. Speaker, this might become as a bit of a shock to the Leader of the Opposition, but in Australia there are very large distances over which Australians travel. And if he thinks, Mr. Speaker, you can have charging stations along the outback way, Mr. Speaker, good luck to him. But what I know from talking to the transport industry, what I know about talking to the vehicle manufacturers is here in Australia, and people like Dr Alan Finkel, is that hydrogen-powered electric vehicles is an Australian solution. It's a solution for Australian transport. Now, that might not go down so well in the cafes of Marrickville, Mr. Speaker. That might not go down so well when he's spinning the discs there pretending to be a DJ.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The members on my right, the Leader of the Opposition, on a point of order other than relevance, because there's already been one taken.
Oh, it was going to be that, Mr. Speaker.
All right. Well, I just think the Leader of the Opposition doesn't have the call. No. Now, the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has the call, and if he's going to say any more, he needs to be specific to the question. Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the CSIRO makes it very clear that hydrogen-powered vehicles power the electricity of those vehicles. Now, Mr Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition doesn't agree with the former Chief Scientist, Dr Alan Finkel, Mr Speaker, I know that there are electric vehicles that you use in inner suburban areas, Mr Speaker, and that's very important. That's fine when people want to make those choices. We're not going to force people to buy those cars, Mr Speaker, by putting up petrol prices, by changing the fuel emission standards, which is nothing more than a sneaky tax on petrol, Mr Speaker. We're not going to do that. We will ensure that we're supporting, through the incentives and the initiatives we're putting in place, but one of the things we're particularly focusing on is hydrogen-powered electric vehicles, Mr Speaker, because those are the things that can transport heavy vehicles and consumer vehicles over long distances, which is what Australia needs. Our approach is following the Australian way. The Leader of the Opposition might want to just go down the path, Mr Speaker, of heavily populated cities in Europe and think that's the solution for us.
The member for Brand.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister claim not to have supported Clive Palmer's High Court case to tear down state borders when we know he spent $1 million doing just that?
Yes. Could you repeat the question?
I certainly can, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister claim not to have supported Clive Palmer's High Court case to tear down state borders when we know he spent $1 million doing just that?
The Prime Minister has the call.
We pulled the case. We didn't pursue the case. We didn't support it, Mr Speaker. We didn't support it.
Members
and I
on
didn't
my
support
left.
it, Mr Speaker, based on the strong representation made to me by Premier McGowan, and I agreed with him.
The member for Nichols has the call.
Thank you, President. My question is to the Minister of Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government has responded to Labor challenges posed to agricultural industries? And how will the government secure the industry's future by providing access to long-term, reliable workforce?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Nichols for his question and acknowledge the challenges his electorate has faced as a result of COVID-19 and the fact that agriculture has historically had to rely on overseas labour for its seasonal requirements. In fact, before COVID-19 we went from around just under 140,000 backpackers now to under 30,000. Of those, around 30% worked in agriculture. So we saw quite quickly that there was a need for government to get involved in not only trying to keep those men and women in this country by giving them the opportunity to stay for another 12 months if they worked in agriculture, because we identified agriculture as an essential service as far back as March last year. But we haven't forgotten Australians. Every one of these jobs must be market tested. Australians get first crack at these jobs. And we've tried to incentivise Australians to take these jobs. Over $60 million worth of incentives to try to get Australians to move around the country and to pick the fruit and to be part of agriculture. Up to $6,000 in reimbursement costs to travel from one end of the country to the other. But we've also tried to get young people to go out there and, in fact, given them an accelerated pathway to AB study and OS study if they go and work in agriculture, to give them that independence away from their parents to be able to qualify for that to go back to uni. And in fact, last week we announced another $5.1 million in a program to incentivise young Australians who are leaving school as we speak to get into agriculture and to think of agriculture not just in a seasonal perspective but also in terms of a long-term career. We've also worked to ensure that those foreign programs have been reopened as quickly as we can. And we did that in August, September last year when we reopened the Pacific schemes. Over 25,000 men and women from 10 Pacific nations that we pre-vetted ready to come in. And in December, the Prime Minister accelerated and removed the red tape to allow those men and women to come in at National Cabinet. He made it clear to the premiers and to the chief health officers if they gave the health orders in which the quarantining of those men and women could come in addition to their caps, we would sign the visas. So we made it clear that we were going to get out of the way of that. And in June this year, proud to say that we've now started an agricultural visa in which we are in bilaterals with 4 nations, of which one, Indonesia, has made it clear that they are very keen to work through that process to sign up to have agricultural workforce, which is transformational. This is bringing the next generation of migrants because we are giving a pathway to permanent residency. This builds regional Australia, brings the next generation of migrants to Australia to build regional Australia and agriculture. But we're also working to ensure there are protections, and the Immigration Minister is bringing in legislation to protect those from being exploited, from workers not only in the agricultural sector but right across the economy. And we're also working with states through the Attorney-General in tighter regulations around labour hire companies. So we are working to put the environment and infrastructure around our farmers to continue to grow their industry to $100 billion by 2030. Good on him.
The member for Dobell. No, sorry, Gilmore.
My question is to the Prime Minister. When my electorate was burning, the Prime Minister's office told journalists he was not on holiday in Hawaii. Why did the Prime Minister's office say that when it wasn't true?
I've got some difficulty with the question because it doesn't relate directly to the Prime Minister. You're asking about his office. So I'm happy to hear a point of order on it. I said I had some difficulty with it, but it didn't, to be blunt, seem to sort of link the accusation to the Prime Minister himself. But I'll hear from whoever was interjecting up there. Please cease. It's never the member for MACNAMARA, so thank you. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, we've had many questions over the years about the actions of the Prime Minister's office when ministers have been asked. There's a series of them have been asked about actions of their offices. And this is a question where their office took an action in answering something about the Prime Minister himself. I just make the point that that's certainly the case, but my recollection is more often than not they've specifically then asked the Prime Minister, about action he's taken himself. But look, I'll allow the question. We'll see how we go.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can only speak to what I have said, Mr Speaker, and as the Leader of the Opposition will know, because I texted him from the plane when I was going on that leave and told him where I was going, and he was fully aware of where I was travelling with my family.
Members on my left, the member for REID.
Mr Speaker, my question...
Members on my left.
My question...
Members, the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister. The Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, the member for REID seeking to ask a question. Leader of the Opposition. The member for REID has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the minister update the House on the importance of the return of international students under the Morrison government's plan to reopen Australia and the opportunities this will create for Australian businesses and workers so we can strengthen our economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister has the call.
Well, can I thank the member for REID for her question, and she's a tremendous advocate for the university sector more generally, and particularly the University of Western Sydney, along with Melissa McIntosh. And, Mr Speaker, today the Prime Minister announced that from the 1st of December, fully vaccinated international students will be able to come into Australia and continue their studies or begin their studies at the beginning of next year. And there's presently about 160,000 international students abroad who are waiting to do exactly that. And, Mr Speaker, this is good news. It's good news for the economy, it's good news for workforce shortages, and it's good news for the education institutions themselves. It's good news for the economy because international education is typically our 3rd biggest export market, constituting about $40 billion per year. about half of which is in fees and the other half in expenditure from international students on local businesses, on accommodation, on the restaurants, the cafes, tourism. There's barely a small business in the CBDs of our cities that don't benefit from international students, Mr Speaker. And overall, as many know, 250,000 Australian jobs are actually supported by the international student market. So it's good for the economy to have these international students back. It's good for workforce shortages because often those international students fill many of the jobs which are vacant and which otherwise wouldn't be filled. Because, Mr Speaker, international students are typically allowed to do 20 hours per week of work when they're here, and when they're not studying they can work full-time. And we have workforce shortages very significantly across this country, particularly in the services area, and they'll be able to come back and immediately fill some of those shortages so that those services can be open and remain open for Australians to be able to benefit from and enjoy as they've got used to. And of course, Mr Speaker, this decision is good for the education institutions themselves. It's good for those institutions because international students can support the social fabric of those institutions, but importantly they provide a significant source of revenue as well. Mr Speaker, this has been broadly supported by people already, including the Business Council of Australia, who says, and I quote, "It will be a massive boost to Australia's economic recovery," and is making sure skills shortages don't hold Australia back. Katrina Jackson from Universities Australia has also warmly welcomed this, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it was a tough decision for this government to close the borders back in March of last year, first to China and then to the rest of the world, but it's the right decision now to reopen them, consistent with the national plan, consistent with Australians getting vaccinated. They've done their side of the bargain, we're doing ours.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning, 5 members of the government voted for Senator Pauline Hanson's extreme bill to abolish public health orders on vaccine certificates that keep people safe and keep businesses open. Didn't the Prime Minister allow this to happen because the Prime Minister failed to show leadership and gave comfort to extremists instead of backing the 90% of Australians who have done the right thing and got vaccinated?
The Prime Minister has the call.
No.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts. Will the Minister please update the House on the news that construction of a world-class passenger terminal is underway at Western Sydney International Nancy Bird Walton Airport, and how the delivery of this project by the Morrison government is delivering jobs for Western Sydney and backing our economic recovery?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, I do thank the member for Lindsay for this question. She is a passionate champion of Western Sydney and, of course, Western Sydney Airport. She brings a strong background in community housing in Western Sydney, and, of course, last Friday she and I were able to join the Prime Minister, the Premier of New South Wales and others at Western Sydney International Nancy Bird Walton Airport to announce the start of construction on the terminal. This will be a bold and confident building, Mr Speaker, reflecting the confidence and aspirations of Western Sydney. And Western Sydney, of course, would be the 3rd largest economy and the 4th largest city in Australia if it were a standalone city. This Western Sydney Airport project, Mr Speaker, now almost 1/4 complete. 22 of 26 million cubic metres of earth have now been moved. Contracts have been signed for the terminal, for the airside civil engineering, including the runway and taxiway, and shortly the landside civils contract will also be signed. This project means jobs for Western Sydney, construction jobs, over 11,000 direct and indirect construction jobs through the life of this project, with half of the current workforce coming from Western Sydney. And by 2031, the airport will deliver 28,000 direct and indirect jobs. Airports around the world are proven job generators, and we are working, the Commonwealth Government, the Morrison government, a Liberal National government, working with the Perrottet government, Liberal National government in New South Wales, with an integrated plan to leverage Western Sydney Airport to attract businesses and jobs, to create the third city, the Western Parkland city, with transport connections like the $11 billion WSA Metro, 6 stations, 23 kilometres, 14,000 jobs. The M12, a $2 billion project. The Northern Road, $1.6 billion, and a planning vision for a livable city where people can live close to jobs, with the Aerotropolis, with the Western Parkland City Authority and, of course, the Western Sydney City Deal, bringing together the Commonwealth, New South Wales governments and 8 local councils. We are backing Western Sydney, Mr Speaker. Western Sydney Airport was in the too hard basket for 6 long years of the Gillard-Rudd government, but when we came to government in 2013, we took a decision in 2014 to proceed with this airport, not for us, the meandering between Wilton and the Richmond RAF base and the various other possibilities. We are backing Western Sydney. Liberal national governments, Commonwealth and New South Wales. Labor took Western Sydney for granted. We're backing Western
time
Sydney.
has concluded. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Treasurer. Why did the Assistant Treasurer say the Minister for Women's Economic Security, Senator Hume, was being, quote, indulgent and quite frankly bizarre when she wrote about the difficulties of juggling work and motherhood?
The Assistant Treasurer.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for her question. I unreservedly apologised to Senator Hume,
Members on my left,
both privately and publicly in relation to private messages that were made public. Senator Hume and I have worked very closely together for many years. We've worked very closely together as members of the Treasury team, very cooperatively. She's an outstanding minister, as I've relayed publicly on many occasions, and as I said, I made very clearly my regret for those comments being made public. They were incorrect. They were incorrect.
Members on my left. The member for Shortland.
Well,
the Minister has the call.
I don't think that's surprising. They were incorrect. It was unfair. And Senator Hume is an outstanding minister, and I've apologised to her privately and publicly.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is committed to supporting women's economic participation and security, particularly as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Chisholm for her question and her keen interest actually in recycling. I was with the member for Chisholm at the Burwood Brickworks, where we launched a national battery recycling scheme, which is incredibly important, and I thank her for her leadership. Mr Speaker, we know that women have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, from making up the majority of the casual and part-time workforce to working in the industries that are hardest hit by the lockdowns. However, the economy is making a comeback, and Australian women are very much part of that comeback. And I saw that confidence earlier this month when I visited the production room of Australian fashion industry leader Q, a family-owned business, to talk about sustainability and the Morrison government's $1 million grant to help the industry recycle textile and clothing waste. And nearly 80% of the 489,000 people who work in Australia's fashion industry, from product to retail, are women. And it's an industry that has a physical presence in every local shopping centre in every town across the country. Fashion is one of the few professionally led industries dominated by women along every step of the supply chain, but it doesn't have to be the only one. As the Treasurer reminds us, there are now more women in work than there were before the pandemic began, a positive trend that I know members on all sides of the chamber acknowledge. And I'm confident, Mr Speaker, that Australian women will continue to lead the economic recovery, especially as we hit our vaccination target rates and we start to reopen. Mr Speaker, that recovery depends on jobs, and the Morrison government supports women's participation in the workforce in ways that suit their families, suit their circumstances and suit the pathways they choose for their lives and their vocations. The Women's Budget this year saw us announce measures from education to training, mentoring, entrepreneurship, childcare that remove barriers, that invite participation and that support women at every age and every stage of work, family and retirement. The Morrison government will continue to back the choices women make and the economic security they create for themselves and for the nation.
The Prime Minister has
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.